Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we journey beneath the waves to a civilization that may never have existed, yet has captivated humanity for over 2,000 years. We seek a city of impossible grandeur, a society of unmatched wisdom, an empire that vanished in a single day and night. This is the story of Atlantis, part history, part philosophy, part dream. A tale that asks not just what was lost, but what we fear to lose and what we hope to find. Get cozy, settle in, and let's begin. Part 1. The birth of a legend, the philosopher's tale. Our story begins not in Atlantis, but in Athens, around 360 BCE. An aging philosopher sat in his academy, surrounded by students eager for wisdom. His name was Plato, and he was about to tell a story that would echo through millennia, inspiring explorers, mystics, scientists, and dreamers. But was it a story or was it history? In two of his dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, Plato described Atlantis in remarkable detail. He presented it not as myth or allegory, but as historical fact, passed down through generations. According to Plato, the story came from Solon, Athens' great lawmaker, who had traveled to Egypt around 590 BCE. There, Egyptian priests in the city of Sais told him of a mighty civilization that had existed 9,000 years before his time, making Atlantis, if real, over 11,000 years old from our perspective. Think about that timeline for a moment. When the Egyptian priests spoke to Solon, they were describing events as ancient to them as the fall of Rome is to us. And Solon lived over 2,000 years before we do. Atlantis, according to this chronology, would have existed around 9600 BCE, near the end of the last ice age, when mammoths still walked the earth and human civilization as we understand it was supposed to be in its infancy. Plato's description. Plato's description of Atlantis was precise, almost obsessively detailed. This wasn't a vague mention of a lost land. It was a complete portrait of a civilization, its geography, its government, its military, its architecture, its ultimate fate. The island lay beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, the gateway between the Mediterranean Sea and the Atlantic Ocean. It was larger than Libya and Asia combined, though scholars debate what Libya and Asia meant in ancient terminology. Some suggest the island might have been the size of a continent. At the heart of Atlantis was a great capital city, arranged in concentric rings. At the very center was a hill where the first kings dwelt, surrounded by alternating rings of water and land. 3 rings of water and 2 rings of land, to be exact. These rings were perfectly circular, as though carved by divine geometry. Massive walls enclosed each ring, covered in precious metals. The outermost wall was coated in brass, the middle wall in tin, and the innermost wall surrounding the central citadel in orichalcum, a mysterious metal that sparkled like fire, mentioned only in ancient texts and never identified with certainty. Some believe it was a form of brass or bronze. Others suggest it was a now lost alloy or even a poetic description of something else entirely. The rings of water served as harbors and canals. Ships from across the known world docked in these ports, bringing goods from every corner of the earth. A great canal, 50 stades long, about 6 miles, connected the outermost ring to the sea, allowing ships to sail directly into the heart of the city. Bridges spanned the water rings and tunnels ran beneath them, large enough for ships to pass through. At the center, on the original hill, stood magnificent temples and palaces. The temple of Poseidon, god of the sea and legendary founder of Atlantis, dominated the citadel, a building so grand that its very description strains belief. The temple's exterior was covered in silver with pinnacles of gold. Inside stood a massive statue of Poseidon driving a chariot pulled by 6 winged horses, surrounded by 100 sea nymphs riding dolphins. The statue was so tall it nearly touched the ceiling. Around the temple ran a wall of gold protecting the sacred precinct. Beyond the city proper, Plato described a vast plain, rectangular in shape and protected by mountains that descended to the sea. This plain was incredibly fertile, producing abundant crops. An intricate system of canals irrigated the entire region, a feat of engineering that would be impressive even today. The Atlanteans themselves, according to Plato, were a mighty people, descended from Poseidon and a mortal woman named Cleito. Poseidon fathered 5 pairs of twin sons with her. The eldest, Atlas, became the first king, and the island was named after him. His descendants ruled for generations, each king governing his portion of the realm. For many generations, the Atlanteans were virtuous. They possessed great wisdom, wealth, and power, but they used it justly. They valued virtue over material wealth, governed themselves with wise laws, and lived in harmony. But as time passed and the divine portion of their heritage diluted through generations of intermarriage with mortals, corruption crept in. Pride replaced wisdom. Greed supplanted virtue. Military conquest became their aim. They assembled a vast army and fleet and set out to conquer the Mediterranean world. They succeeded in subjugating parts of Europe and Africa, advancing as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia, roughly modern-day Italy. Only Athens stood against them. In a great battle, the Athenians defeated the Atlantean forces, saving the civilized world from tyranny. But the gods were not finished with Atlantis. Zeus, king of the gods, looked upon the Atlanteans' corruption and decided they must be punished. He called the gods together to pronounce judgment, and here, frustratingly, Plato's account ends. The dialogue, Critias, breaks off mid-sentence, never revealing what punishment Zeus decreed. But in Timaeus, Plato had already told us the outcome. In a single day and night of misfortune, Atlantis was swallowed by the sea and vanished beneath the waves. Earthquakes and floods sent by the gods destroyed the mighty civilization utterly. Where once had stood the greatest city in the world, there was now only ocean, impassable because of the mud left by the sunken island. Was Plato speaking literally? For over 2,000 years, scholars have debated a fundamental question. Did Plato intend this as history or as allegory? Many of Plato's other works use fictional stories to illustrate philosophical points. His Allegory of the Cave is famously symbolic, not literal. His description of the ideal state in the Republic was a thought experiment, not a historical claim. Could Atlantis be the same? A parable about the dangers of hubris, the corrupting influence of power, the importance of virtue? The story certainly works as allegory. Atlantis begins as an ideal society, wealthy, powerful, just, but falls into corruption and is destroyed. It's a perfect cautionary tale about the impermanence of greatness, the inevitable decline of civilizations that abandon virtue. Athens, in contrast, is portrayed as the virtuous underdog that defeats the mighty but corrupt empire, a flattering story for Plato's Athenian audience. Moreover, the numbers Plato uses are suspiciously neat and often multiples of sacred numerological values. The dimensions of the city, the timeline, the armies, all seem almost too perfect, as though designed for symbolic rather than historical purposes. Yet Plato insisted his account was true. He specifically stated that unlike a myth or fable, this was actual history, passed down from reliable sources. Solon was a real person, one of Athens' most revered statesmen. The Egyptian priests were known for keeping meticulous historical records spanning thousands of years. Why would Plato be so insistent on the story's veracity if it was merely an invention? Some scholars suggest a middle path. Perhaps Plato based his story on real historical events but embellished and idealized them to serve his philosophical purposes. Maybe there was a real civilization that was destroyed catastrophically, and that memory was preserved in Egyptian records. but the details Plato provided were his own elaboration. We may never know Plato's true intent. He is long dead, and we have only his words, not his thoughts. But his ambiguity, intentional or not, created something remarkable, a mystery that has compelled humanity to search for truth in the depths of both ocean and imagination. Part 2. The ancient echoes other flood myths. Plato's account of Atlantis was not written in isolation. His world, like ours, was filled with stories of civilizations destroyed by flood, of divine punishment through water, of golden ages lost beneath the waves. The most famous, of course, is the biblical flood Noah and the Ark, 40 days and nights of rain, the world cleansed and renewed. But flood myths appear in nearly every ancient culture. In Mesopotamia, the Epic of Gilgamesh tells of Utnapishtim, who built a great boat to survive a flood sent by the gods to destroy humanity. This story predates the biblical account by at least 1,000 years and shares remarkable parallels with it. Greek mythology is replete with flood stories. Deucalion, son of Prometheus, built an ark to survive a flood Zeus sent to destroy the corrupt Bronze Age of humanity. Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha were the only survivors, and from them, a new human race descended. Hindu texts describe multiple cycles of creation and destruction, often involving great floods. The Matsya Purana tells of Manu, warned by a fish, an avatar of Vishnu, of a coming deluge. Manu built a boat and preserved life through the catastrophe. Norse mythology speaks of a time when Ymir, the primordial frost giant, was killed and his blood drowned all, the frost giants except 2, who survived to repopulate. Native American traditions from across both continents contain flood myths: the Hopi, the Cree, the Aztec, the Maya, the Inca, each describing catastrophic inundations and the survival of a remnant. Chinese legends tell of the Great Flood during the reign of Emperor Yao, which lasted for generations and required the engineering genius of Yu the Great to control. Australian Aboriginal stories describe Dreamtime floods that reshaped the land. Pacific Island cultures preserve memories of rising seas and sunken lands. Why are flood myths so universal? Skeptics suggest it's because floods are common disasters experienced by societies worldwide. Every culture living near water will eventually experience devastating floods, and these traumatic events enter cultural memory and mythology. But others point to the end of the last ice age, approximately 11,600 years ago, intriguingly close to Plato's timeline for Atlantis. As glaciers melted, sea levels rose dramatically, perhaps as much as 400 feet globally. Coastal settlements would have been inundated. Islands would have vanished. Entire landscapes were drowned. Could these myths, including Atlantis, be distant memories of real events, not necessarily divine punishment, but genuine catastrophes that our ancestors survived and remembered? Could Plato's tale preserve a kernel of truth about a real civilization lost to rising seas at the end of the Ice Age? Ancient accounts of Atlantis. Plato was not the only ancient writer to mention Atlantis, though he was certainly the most detailed. His account was read and discussed by philosophers, historians, and scholars throughout antiquity. Crantor, a philosopher who lived about a century after Plato, reportedly traveled to Egypt to verify the story. According to later sources, Egyptian priests confirmed the account, and Crantor claimed to have seen columns in Egypt inscribed with the history of Atlantis. Unfortunately, neither these columns nor Crantor's own writings have survived for us to verify. Plutarch, the great biographer and philosopher writing in the 1st century CE, mentioned Atlantis in his discussions but seemed skeptical, treating it more as a philosophical concept than historical reality. Pliny the Elder, a Roman natural historian, mentioned islands that had sunk into the sea, and later writers would connect these to Atlantis, though Pliny himself didn't make that link explicit. Proclus, a later Neoplatonist philosopher in the 5th century CE, defended the literal truth of Atlantis, arguing that Plato would not have lied about such matters, and that the story's specificity suggested historical fact rather than allegory. But not all ancient thinkers accepted the tale. Aristotle, Plato's most famous student, apparently dismissed Atlantis as fiction, a story Plato invented to make philosophical points. He who invented it also destroyed it, Aristotle reportedly said, suggesting his teacher created and sank Atlantis as a literary device. What's fascinating is that the debate began immediately. From the moment Plato published his dialogues, some people believed and others doubted. That argument continues today, unchanged in its essentials across 2,400 years. The long sleep after the fall of Rome and through the medieval period, interest in Atlantis largely faded in Europe. The dialogues of Plato were preserved but not widely read. The medieval mind was focused on Christian theology rather than ancient Greek philosophy. Atlantis slept, waiting for a world ready to dream of it again. Arab scholars preserved Greek texts, including Plato's works, and wrote commentaries on them. Some Islamic scholars discussed Atlantis, treating it variously as history, allegory, or pure fiction. But it remained a minor footnote in the larger corpus of ancient wisdom they preserved. It wasn't until the Renaissance, when Europe rediscovered its classical heritage, that Atlantis began its long return to cultural consciousness. As Greek texts were translated and circulated, and as European explorers began sailing to new worlds, the idea of a lost civilization beyond the Pillars of Hercules suddenly seemed less fantastic and more possible. Part 3. The Age of Exploration. Columbus and the New World. When Christopher Columbus sailed west in 1492 seeking a route to Asia, he changed more than geography. He changed what humanity believed was possible. If new continents existed beyond the ocean unknown to the ancients, what else might be real that had been dismissed as myth? Some early explorers and scholars wondered if the Americas themselves might be Atlantis, or remnants of it. The indigenous civilizations Columbus encountered, the Taino, and later the Aztec, Maya, and Inca, possessed sophisticated knowledge, monumental architecture, and advanced societies. Could they be descendants of Atlantean survivors? The idea wasn't as absurd as it might sound today. These were civilizations that had built massive pyramids, developed complex calendars, created extensive road networks, and governed vast empires. Achievements that impressed and often baffled their European conquerors, who had assumed they would find only savages. Spanish chroniclers recorded indigenous legends of catastrophic floods and sunken lands. The Aztecs spoke of previous worlds destroyed by calamity. The Maya had sophisticated flood myths. Could these be memories of Atlantis? Of course, we now know the Americas were populated by migrations from Asia tens of thousands of years ago, developing their own distinct and remarkable civilizations. But in the 16th and 17th centuries, with European knowledge of human history still limited, the Atlantis connection seemed plausible to some. Francis Bacon's New Atlantis. In 1626, the English philosopher and statesman Francis Bacon published New Atlantis, a utopian novel about a society living on an island called Bensalem in the Pacific Ocean. The inhabitants were descendants of Atlantean survivors who had escaped the catastrophe and built an ideal society based on reason and science. Bacon's work wasn't about finding the historical Atlantis. It was using the Atlantis concept to envision an ideal future society. But it demonstrated how Atlantis had become more than just Plato's story. It had become a symbol, a template for imagining alternative and better worlds. The New Atlantis was a scientific utopia, governed by wise philosophers and dedicated to the advancement of knowledge. It influenced Enlightenment thinking and arguably the founding principles of scientific institutions and even aspects of American democracy. The idea of Atlantis, as an advanced, lost civilization, became a mirror in which people could contemplate what society might be or should be. The search begins. As European knowledge of geography expanded, scholars and adventurers began proposing specific locations for Atlantis. If Plato's account was historical, then Atlantis must have existed somewhere real. But where? The Canary Islands and the Azores Atlantic island chains became early candidates. They lay beyond the Strait of Gibraltar in the Atlantic, matching Plato's placement. Perhaps these were the mountain peaks of a sunken continent, the highest points still above water. Geological surveys would later show these islands are volcanic, rising from the seafloor rather than being remnants of a sunken landmass. But in the 17th and 18th centuries, they seemed like plausible locations. The Caribbean was another candidate, especially after explorers realized it contained thousands of islands and vast, shallow seas. Could these be remnants of Atlantis? Some scholars look to the Mediterranean itself, suggesting Plato's description of Atlantis being beyond the Pillars of Hercules was an error or metaphor. Perhaps Atlantis had been in the Mediterranean all along, and the Pillars reference was symbolic rather than literal. The search for Atlantis became entwined with the broader quest to understand Earth's geological history. In the 19th century, as geology emerged as a science, and as theorists proposed that Earth's crust had undergone massive changes, continents moving, seas rising and falling, the possibility of a sunken landmass seemed less fantastical. Part 4. The Scientific Age and New Theories, Ignatius Donnelly and Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. In 1882, an American politician and writer named Ignatius Donnelly published a book that would fundamentally reshape the Atlantis myth for the modern age. Atlantis, the Antediluvian World. Donnelly's book was a sensation. It became a bestseller and went through numerous editions. In it, Donnelly argued passionately and in exhaustive detail that Atlantis was not only real, but was the source of all human civilization. He proposed that Atlantis had been a vast mid-Atlantic continent, a bridge between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. When it sank catastrophically, its survivors fled east and west, bringing their advanced knowledge to less developed peoples. According to Donnelly, this explained the similarities between Old World and New World civilizations, the pyramids in both Egypt and Mesoamerica, the flood myths found in multiple cultures, the linguistic parallels between distant languages. Donnelly marshaled an impressive array of evidence, from mythology and linguistics to geology and biology. He noted that certain plants and animals appeared on both sides of the Atlantic and argued this proved a former land bridge. He analyzed flood myths from across the world and claimed they all described the same catastrophe, the sinking of Atlantis. His theory was bold, comprehensive, and wrong, at least in its specifics. Modern geology has proven conclusively that no Atlantic continent existed and sank within human memory. The Atlantic floor is spreading, not sinking. The mid-Atlantic ridge is rising, not the remnant of a collapsed continent. But Donnelly's book succeeded brilliantly in capturing the public imagination. It presented Atlantis not as ancient philosophy or idle speculation, but as a scientific hypothesis, complete with data, arguments, and evidence. The fact that his evidence was often misinterpreted, his arguments flawed, and his conclusions unsupported didn't matter to millions of readers who found his vision compelling. Donnelly's Atlantis was romantic and grand, a super civilization that had given birth to all human achievement, destroyed in a cosmic catastrophe, remembered only in myth. It appealed to a Victorian age hungry for grand narratives, for connections between the ancient past and the progressive present. for evidence that humanity was capable of greatness beyond what the primitive state implied by evolution suggested. Theosophy and mystical Atlantis. As Donnelly was popularizing Atlantis in the scientific realm, or pseudo-scientific depending on your perspective, others were taking it in a spiritual direction. Helena Blavatsky, founder of the Theosophical movement, incorporated Atlantis into her elaborate cosmology. In her massive work, The Secret Doctrine, in 1888, she described Atlantis as the home of the fourth root race of humanity. Spiritual beings who had degenerated into materialism and were destroyed for their sins. According to theosophical teaching, Atlanteans possessed psychic powers and advanced technology powered by spiritual energy. They could manipulate matter with their minds, built crystal-powered cities, and achieved feats of engineering through esoteric knowledge rather than mechanical means. This mystical Atlantis bore little resemblance to Plato's account, but it captivated those interested in spiritualism, occultism, and alternative histories. Blavatsky claimed her knowledge came from ancient masters and secret teachings, not from archaeology or historical research. Other mystics and mediums claimed to channel Atlantean spirits, to remember past lives in Atlantis, to receive visions of the lost civilization. Edgar Cayce, the famous sleeping prophet, delivered hundreds of readings about Atlantis while in trance states, describing it as a technologically advanced society that destroyed itself through the misuse of powerful crystals. These mystical versions of Atlantis, while fascinating to their adherents, moved Atlantis further from any potential historical reality and deeper into the realm of myth and spiritual allegory. The Santorini-Thera theory. Not all Atlantis theories relied on mysticism or questionable geology. In the 1960s, a Greek archaeologist named Spiridon Marinatos proposed a theory that brought Atlantis back to the realm of serious academic consideration. Marinatos had been studying the Minoan civilization, which flourished on Crete and surrounding islands from roughly 2700 to 1450 BCE. The Minoans built sophisticated palaces. The legendary labyrinth at Knossos was a Minoan palace, created beautiful art, developed linear A script, still undeciphered, and dominated the Aegean Sea through trade and naval power. Then around 1600 BCE, the Minoan civilization suffered a catastrophic blow. Many settlements were abandoned or destroyed. The civilization's power waned dramatically, and within a few centuries it was absorbed by the Mycenaean Greeks. Marinatos proposed that the cause was one of history's most violent volcanic eruptions. The explosion of the island of Thera, modern Santorini, about 70 miles north of Crete. The Thera eruption was cataclysmic. Geologists estimate it was 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa's 1883 eruption, which killed tens of thousands and was heard 3,000 miles away. The Thera eruption blasted an estimated 24 cubic miles of rock into the atmosphere. The island literally exploded, leaving a caldera, a massive crater filled with water, where the mountain had been. The eruption would have generated massive tsunamis that devastated the coasts of Crete and surrounding islands. Ash fallout would have blanketed the region, making agriculture impossible for years. The psychological impact of witnessing such destruction, the sky dark with ash, the sea rising in massive walls, entire communities vanished in hours, would have been profound. Marinatos theorized that this event, catastrophic as it was to the Minoan world, might be the historical kernel behind Plato's Atlantis story. Perhaps Plato, or his sources, had heard accounts of the Minoan civilization and its sudden decline, embellished over 1,000 years of retelling, and placed it in a more distant past and exotic location. The theory has its appealing aspects. The Minoans were an advanced Bronze Age civilization, sophisticated in art, architecture, and governance. They lived on islands in the Mediterranean, though not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. They were destroyed by a catastrophe involving the sea, tsunami, and geological violence, a volcanic eruption. Their end was sudden and dramatic. Moreover, the Thera eruption actually happened. We can see the caldera today, a stunning geological remnant of that ancient violence. We can study the ash layers across the Mediterranean. We can excavate the buried city of Akrotiri on Santorini, a Bronze Age town preserved under volcanic ash like a Greek Pompeii. But the theory has problems. The timeline is wrong. Thera erupted around 1600 BCE, not 9600 BCE as Plato claimed. The location is wrong. Thera is in the Aegean, not beyond Gibraltar. The size is wrong. Thera was a small island, not a continent-sized landmass. Supporters of the theory argue Plato simply got some details wrong, or that errors accumulated as the story was passed down through generations. Critics argue that adjusting Plato's account this dramatically makes Atlantis meaningless. If you change the location, time, size, and nature of the civilization, in what sense are you still talking about Atlantis? Still, the Thera theory remains one of the most scientifically grounded Atlantis hypotheses. It connects a real archaeological civilization with a real geological catastrophe and suggests how that real history might have been transformed into Plato's legend. Part 5. The search continues. The search in the Atlantic. Despite geological evidence against a sunken Atlantic continent, searches in the Atlantic Ocean itself have continued, fueled by sonar anomalies, underwater formations, and the eternal human hope that maybe, just maybe, we'll find proof. In 1968, a pilot named Robert Brush photographed what appeared to be submerged stone structures near Bimini in the Bahamas. The Bimini Road, as it came to be called, looked in aerial photos like a paved road or wall beneath the water. Straight lines of rectangular stones stretching for half a mile. Was this evidence of an ancient civilization, perhaps Atlantis itself, now underwater due to rising sea levels since the Ice Age? Marine geologists who investigated concluded the formation was natural. Beach rock, a type of limestone that forms along coastlines and can fracture into rectangular blocks. The road is simply a natural geological feature that happens to look artificial from above. But the controversy continues. Some researchers insist the regularity of the stones, their arrangement, and other nearby formations suggest human construction. Mainstream science remains unconvinced, but the Bimini Road has become a pilgrimage site for Atlantis believers. Similar claims have emerged from other locations. Sonar surveys have detected what some interpret as artificial structures on the seafloor near the Azores, off the coast of Spain, near Cuba, and in numerous other Atlantic locations. In each case, further investigation has failed to provide convincing evidence of human construction, but the claims persist. The problem is that the ocean floor, like the land, has natural features that can look artificial. Underwater volcanic formations, erosion patterns, and geological structures can create shapes that appear too regular or organized to be natural. Our pattern-seeking brains see walls, roads, buildings, and formations that are simply the result of natural processes. Moreover, the ocean is vast and largely unexplored. Less than 20% of the ocean floor has been mapped in high resolution. Could Atlantis be hiding in the unmapped 80%? It's possible, but as our surveying technology improves and we map more of the ocean, the places where a civilization-sized island could hide grow fewer. Antarctica and other exotic theories. As the Atlantic has proven disappointing for Atlantis hunters, some have looked to more exotic locations. In 1958, Charles Hapgood, a professor of history, published a controversial theory about crustal displacement. The idea that Earth's crust could shift relative to its axis, moving continents rapidly to new latitudes. He suggested that Antarctica, now under miles of ice, might once have been in a temperate location and could have hosted advanced civilizations. Could Antarctica be Atlantis? A once temperate land now buried under ice? The theory has a certain appeal. Ancient maps, like the Peary Race map of 1513, appear to show details of Antarctic coastlines that wouldn't be rediscovered until the 20th century. How could medieval map makers know Antarctica's coast unless they had access to ancient maps from a time before the ice? Mainstream geology rejects crustal displacement as Hapgood envisioned it. While continents do move through plate tectonics, they move slowly, centimeters per year, not catastrophically. Antarctica has been at its current polar position for millions of years, long before humans existed. As for the maps, scholars have provided more mundane explanations, errors, educated guesses, or coincidental resemblances to actual coastlines. The Peary Race map, for instance, likely shows a distorted South American coast, not Antarctica. Still, the Antarctica theory refuses to die. Each time ground-penetrating radar reveals structures beneath the ice, usually just geological features, claims resurface that Atlantis has been found. Other theories have placed Atlantis in the North Sea, now shallow but once partially dry during the Ice Age. The Black Sea, which may have flooded catastrophically when the Mediterranean broke through the Bosphorus. The Mediterranean itself at various locations, including Sardinia, Malta, and Troy. The Caribbean, particularly the shallow waters around Cuba and Bimini, the Pacific, with some claiming Atlantis was actually in the Pacific and Plato simply got the ocean wrong. Indonesia, with the Sunda Shelf that was above water during the Ice Age, the Sahara Desert, suggesting Atlantis wasn't an island but a fertile region now turned to desert, the Richete structure in Mauritania, a circular geological formation that superficially matches Plato's description. Each theory has its advocates, its evidence, often misinterpreted, and its rebuttals. Each represents a different attempt to fit Plato's square peg into the round hole of known geography and geology. Part 6. Atlantis in popular culture, literature, and film. While scholars debated and explorers searched, Atlantis found its most enduring home in popular culture. It became a setting for countless novels, stories, films, and television shows, a lost world where anything was possible. Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, 1870, featured Captain Nemo and crew discovering the ruins of Atlantis on the ocean floor, a scene that captured imaginations and established Atlantis as a staple of adventure fiction. In the 20th century, Atlantis appeared in pulp adventure stories featuring heroes discovering the lost city, science fiction where Atlantis was the source of advanced technology. Fantasy novels where Atlantis was a magical civilization, comic books, including Marvel and DC universes where Atlantis exists as an underwater kingdom, animated films like Disney's Atlantis: The Lost Empire, 2001, which introduced Atlantis to a new generation. These cultural depictions have shaped how many people imagine Atlantis, more than Plato's description ever did. For most people, Atlantis isn't primarily an ancient Greek philosophical text. It's underwater cities with crystal domes, advanced ancient technology, mystical powers, and dramatic catastrophes. This cultural Atlantis, divorced from Plato's original, has become its own entity. A mythological space where storytellers can explore themes of hubris, lost knowledge, environmental catastrophe, and the dangers of unchecked technological advancement. The Aquaman effect modern depictions, particularly in superhero media, have added another layer to Atlantis mythology. Aquaman's Atlantis, for instance, is a thriving underwater civilization with advanced technology, political intrigue, and ongoing relevance to the surface world. This reverses the traditional Atlantis narrative. Instead of a lost, dead civilization to be rediscovered and mourned, it's a living, powerful society that chose isolation. The catastrophe that sank Atlantis becomes ancient history, and the descendants of Atlanteans continue their civilization beneath the waves. This version of Atlantis speaks to different concerns than Plato's original. It's about the relationship between progress and environment, about hidden powers and secret histories, about what we might be missing in our ignorance of the ocean depths. Part 7. The question of evidence. What would proof look like? After 2,400 years of searching, why haven't we found Atlantis? Believers and skeptics answer this question very differently. Skeptics point out that we have found no credible evidence because there is no credible evidence to find. Atlantis was Plato's invention, a philosophical thought experiment, and searching for it is like searching for Middle-earth or Narnia. These are fictional, places however vividly described. But believers counter. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The ocean is vast and largely unexplored. Ancient cities can be hard to recognize even on land, let alone underwater and potentially buried under sediment. We continue to discover lost cities and civilizations. Why not Atlantis? What would proof of Atlantis actually look like? What would convince the skeptics? It would require a location that matches Plato's description. Beyond the Strait of Gibraltar, the right size and shape, with the characteristic concentric rings or clear remnants thereof. Evidence of habitation, not just natural formations, but clear signs of human construction, buildings, tools, writing, art, infrastructure dating that fits the timeline. Either around 9600 BCE, Plato's date, or evidence that Plato's source had the date wrong but the location right. A scale that matches the descriptions. A city and civilization large enough to be the empire Plato described evidence of catastrophic destruction. Geological proof that the site was destroyed suddenly by natural disaster, particularly involving water. No site proposed to date has met all these criteria. The Thera-Santorini theory meets some, but the wrong location and wrong date. The Bimini Road has the right general location, but no clear evidence of construction or habitation. The Risha structure has an interesting shape, but is in the desert, nowhere near the sea. The burden of proof. This brings us to a fundamental question of epistemology, the philosophy of knowledge. Where does the burden of proof lie? Skeptics argue that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. If you claim a continent-sized civilization existed and vanished, you need strong proof, not ambiguous underwater formations or debatable ancient maps, but clear, convincing evidence. Believers sometimes flip this, arguing that Plato's detailed account itself is evidence, and the burden is on skeptics to prove it's false. Update Atlantis narration. Believers sometimes flip this, arguing that Plato's detailed account itself is evidence, and the burden is on skeptics to prove it's false. Plato was a respected philosopher. Believers sometimes flip this, arguing that Plato's detailed account itself is evidence, and the burden is on skeptics to prove it's false. Plato was a respected philosopher, not a fantasy writer. Why would he fabricate such a detailed false history? The skeptical response is that the burden of proof always lies with the positive claim. If someone says unicorns exist, the burden is on them to provide a unicorn, not on everyone else to search every forest proving they don't exist. But perhaps we're asking the wrong question. Perhaps did Atlantis exist is less interesting than why do we need Atlantis to exist? Part 8. What Atlantis really is. The Ur civilization fantasy stripped of specifics, Atlantis represents something powerful in human consciousness. The idea of the Ur civilization, the original advanced society from which all others descended. This idea is appealing for several reasons. It offers simplicity in the face of complexity. How did ancient civilizations across the world build pyramids, develop sophisticated astronomy, create complex societies? The diffusionist answer, they all learned from one original source, is simpler than the multi-generationist answer that humans independently developed similar solutions to similar problems. It suggests lost golden ages. We like to believe there were times when humanity was better, wiser, more advanced than we are now. The myth of decline, that we've fallen from some previous height, is deeply embedded in many cultures. Atlantis embodies this perfectly. A super civilization destroyed by its own hubris. It validates ancient wisdom. If Atlantis existed and spread knowledge to primitive peoples, then ancient monuments, myths, and practices aren't merely historical curiosities. They're echoes of this greater wisdom. It promises lost knowledge still to be found. Atlantis suggests there are secrets yet to be rediscovered, technologies we've lost, wisdom we've forgotten. It makes the past mysterious and promising rather than simply primitive. But the Ur civilization model has problems beyond the lack of archaeological evidence. It's often implicitly Eurocentric or at least civilization-centric, implying that indigenous peoples couldn't have achieved what they did without outside help. This has been used, unfortunately, to diminish the genuine achievements of ancient peoples. The idea that ancient Egyptians couldn't have built the pyramids without Atlantean help, or that the Maya couldn't have developed their calendar without outside intervention, robs these civilizations of credit for their own brilliance. It suggests they were passive recipients of knowledge rather than creative innovators in their own right. Modern archaeology has shown again and again that humans are remarkably innovative and that similar environmental challenges and opportunities lead to similar solutions. Pyramids appear in multiple cultures not because of Atlantean influence, but because a pyramid is a stable structure that can be built tall using primitive technology. It's a logical solution to the problem. How do we build something really big? The warning of hubris. But if we strip away the literal search for a lost continent and look at what Plato actually wrote, a different Atlantis emerges, one that's more relevant than ever. Plato's Atlantis is a cautionary tale about the corrupting influence of power and wealth. The Atlanteans begin virtuous but slowly degenerate as material success makes them arrogant. They value conquest over wisdom, power over virtue, and for this they're destroyed. This story resonates across centuries because it's perennially relevant. Every civilization that rises worries about its own decline. Every generation sees its elders warning that prosperity is making people soft, that moral decay is setting in, that disaster looms if society doesn't return to virtue. The specific details of Plato's Atlantis, the concentric rings, the orichalcum, the canal systems, might be embellishments or metaphors. But the core story is timeless. Civilizations that lose their moral foundation, however technologically or militarily advanced they become, are vulnerable to catastrophe. In this reading, it doesn't matter if Atlantis literally existed. The story's truth is moral and psychological, not archaeological. Atlantis is every civilization that has fallen or might fall. It's a mirror in which we see our own society's strengths and weaknesses reflected. The environmental parable modern readers often notice something Plato's ancient audience might not have emphasized. Atlantis is also an environmental parable. The Atlanteans achieved mastery over nature. They built canals, controlled water, extracted resources, shaped their island to their will. They became so powerful they felt invincible. And then nature struck back with earthquakes and floods that their technology couldn't defend against. This resonates powerfully in our age of climate change, where humanity's industrial civilization has achieved unprecedented control over the natural world, but faces catastrophic consequences from the environmental damage that control has caused. Atlantis becomes a warning. No matter how advanced your technology, you can't escape the natural systems you're part of. Disrupt those systems too much and catastrophe follows, whether divine punishment, in Plato's telling, or natural consequences in our modern understanding. The sinking of Atlantis from this perspective is eerily like rising sea levels threatening coastal cities today. The hubris of believing technology makes you invincible against nature's power is the same hubris leading to our current climate crisis. Whether Plato intended this reading or not, Atlantis serves as a parable for our time. The lost paradise. There's another, more psychological dimension to Atlantis's appeal. It represents paradise lost, the perfect place that once was but can never be again. Humans seem hardwired to imagine lost golden ages. We see this in the biblical Garden of Eden, in the Greek Golden Age of Cronus, in Nordic Asgard before Ragnarok, in countless myths of falls from grace and exiles from paradise. Psychologists and scholars have various theories about why we do this. Perhaps it's nostalgia for childhood when life seemed simpler and parents protected us from harsh realities. Perhaps it's a coping mechanism. If things were better once, they could be better again. Perhaps it's genuine cultural memory of easier times. The end of the Ice Age brought dramatic environmental changes that must have seemed catastrophic to our ancestors. Whatever the reason, Atlantis taps into this deep psychological need for a lost, perfect place. It's not just a civilization that existed, it's the civilization, the ideal society, wise and just and powerful, existing in harmony until corruption brought it down. This makes Atlantis emotionally powerful regardless of its historical status. It's the same reason people are moved by stories of Camelot, Avalon, Shangri-La, El Dorado. These are all versions of the same archetypal lost paradise, and they speak to something deep in the human psyche. The mystery itself. Finally, we must acknowledge that part of Atlantis's appeal is simply that it's a mystery. And humans love mysteries. The very fact that we don't know whether Atlantis existed makes it more intriguing than if we had definitively found it or definitively disproven it. The uncertainty creates space for imagination, for speculation, for hope. If we found Atlantis tomorrow, say, archaeologists discovered a site that matched every detail of Plato's description, it would be the greatest archaeological discovery in history. And then it would become history, studied and cataloged and understood. The mystery would be solved, and something would be lost. As long as Atlantis remains unfound, it can be anything. It can be a scientific hypothesis or a mystical vision. It can be a warning or a promise. It can be wherever we need it to be, whatever we need it to mean. This is why Atlantis theories proliferate rather than consolidate. Each person's Atlantis is different because each person needs something different from it. The scholar needs historical vindication, the mystic needs spiritual truth. The adventurer needs a quest. The environmentalist needs a warning. The dreamer needs hope. Atlantis is a mirror, and what we see in it tells us more about ourselves than about the ancient past. Part 9. The verdict of evidence, what science says. Let's be clear about what modern science tells us regarding the literal historical existence of Atlantis as Plato described it. Geology. There is no evidence of a continent-sized landmass in the Atlantic Ocean that sank within the time frame of human civilization. The Atlantic Ocean floor is spreading at mid-ocean ridges, not sinking. The geological record doesn't support a catastrophic sinking of a large landmass around 9600 BCE or any other time in the past 50 million years. Archaeology. Despite over a century of underwater archaeology and extensive mapping of ancient coastlines, no evidence of a Bronze Age or earlier advanced civilization in the Atlantic has been found. The sophisticated civilizations we know from that era, Egypt, Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, China, are all well documented and none match Plato's description of Atlantis. Oceanography. The Atlantic Ocean floor has been extensively surveyed, especially in the relatively shallow areas where a landmass would be most likely. While we haven't mapped every square meter in high resolution, We've mapped enough to say with confidence that no civilization-sized island exists undiscovered. History. No ancient source independent of Plato mentions Atlantis. Egyptian records, despite being extensive and covering thousands of years, make no mention of Atlantis. Neither do Mesopotamian, Hittite, Phoenician, or any other ancient records. The scientific consensus is clear. Atlantis, as Plato described it, a continent-sized island beyond the Pillars of Hercules that sank around 9600 BCE, did not exist. What history might preserve. However, that doesn't necessarily mean Plato invented everything from whole cloth. Historical memories can be preserved in distorted forms, and catastrophic events do get remembered, if not always accurately. We know that. Sea levels rose dramatically at the end of the Ice Age, approximately 11,600 years ago, close to Plato's timeline. This flooding was not catastrophic in the Hollywood sense. It happened over centuries, but it was dramatic enough that early coastal settlements would have been inundated. Could this be the distant memory preserved in Atlantis and other flood myths? The Bronze Age Mediterranean experienced genuine catastrophes. The Thera eruption around 1600 BCE, the Bronze Age collapse around 1200 BCE, when multiple civilizations fell within a few decades. Various earthquakes and tsunamis. The ancient world was no stranger to sudden disasters that destroyed civilizations. Some places did literally sink. Port Royal in Jamaica partially sank in an earthquake in 1692. The ancient Egyptian city of Heracleion was discovered underwater in 2000, having sunk due to earthquakes and rising sea levels. Pavlopatri in Greece is a Bronze Age city now beneath the waves. Places do get swallowed by the sea. The megalithic culture of Atlantic Europe built impressive stone monuments, Stonehenge, Newgrange, Karnak, and traded across vast distances. Could garbled memories of this culture, combined with later catastrophes, have contributed to the Atlantis story? So while Plato's specific Atlantis didn't exist, the story might preserve genuine historical memories of sea level rise at the end of the Ice Age, Bronze Age civilizations destroyed by natural disasters. Advanced ancient cultures whose achievements seemed impressive to later peoples. Real places that sank into the sea. These memories could have been combined, embellished, and moved to a more exotic location beyond the known world to create the Atlantis story. The most likely explanation, the most parsimonious explanation, the one that requires the fewest unsupported assumptions, is this. Plato created Atlantis as a philosophical device, an idealized civilization that fell into corruption, used to illustrate his ideas about ideal societies, the dangers of hubris, and the nature of justice. He may have drawn inspiration from stories of the Minoan civilization and its catastrophic decline, Egyptian records of ancient conflicts and destructions, natural disasters he knew about from history and legend, his own imagination and philosophical goals. He presented it as history to give it rhetorical weight, the same way political philosophers today might use real historical examples, even if loosely, to make philosophical points. The story resonated because it touched on universal themes: lost golden ages, divine punishment for hubris, catastrophic change. As it was retold and reinterpreted across centuries, different aspects were emphasized depending on the cultural moment. Philosophical allegory in ancient times, lost Christian kingdom in medieval thought, prehistoric super-civilization in the 19th century, environmental warning in ours. This explanation accounts for why Plato's description is so detailed. He was creating a persuasive philosophical argument. Why no contemporary sources mention Atlantis. It was Plato's creation, not a historical consensus. Why no archaeological evidence has been found. There's nothing to find. Why the story has such lasting appeal. It addresses perennial human concerns. The Atlantis within. Why we search the search for Atlantis is really a search for ourselves. We're looking for proof that humanity is capable of greatness beyond what we usually achieve. Knowledge and wisdom can be lost but also recovered. Our own civilization's triumphs are not unprecedented. Catastrophe, if it comes, is not the end of everything. There are still mysteries to solve, wonders to discover. We're also searching for warnings that hubris leads to downfall, that environmental exploitation brings catastrophe, that power corrupts unless constrained by virtue, that no matter how advanced we become, we remain vulnerable. Both the hope and the warning are worth holding on to, whether Atlantis literally existed or not. The real lost Atlantis. But here's a thought. Perhaps we're looking in the wrong direction. Perhaps the real Atlantis, the real lost civilization we should mourn and try to recover is not beneath the ocean, but within ourselves. What knowledge have we lost as we've progressed? Ancient peoples knew the stars intimately, navigated by them, organized their lives around celestial cycles. Most modern people can barely identify constellations. Indigenous cultures possessed sophisticated ecological knowledge built over millennia. Much of it lost as those cultures were destroyed or assimilated. We've lost languages, crafts, stories, relationships with the natural world, communal bonds, spiritual practices. Each of these is a kind of Atlantis, something valuable that sank beneath the waves of modernity and progress, perhaps irretrievably. The real search for Atlantis might be the search to recover these lost aspects of human wisdom and experience, to balance our technological advancement with ecological awareness, our material wealth with spiritual depth, our individual achievement with communal bonds. The eternal return. Every generation rediscovers Atlantis and reimagines it according to their needs. Our ancestors saw it as divine punishment for sin. The Victorians saw it as a prehistoric super-civilization that seeded all later cultures. The New Age movement saw it as a mystical society with spiritual technologies. We see it as an environmental warning about climate change and hubris. Future generations will find new meanings in the story, new reasons to search, new places to look. Atlantis will never be definitively found or disproven because it exists primarily in imagination, where it serves functions no archaeological discovery could fulfill. And perhaps that's okay. Perhaps we need Atlantis the mystery more than we need Atlantis the archaeological site. We need the question mark, the unknown, the possibility. We need to believe that the past holds secrets, that wisdom has been lost and might be recovered, that our current civilization is not the apex of human achievement, but one point in a longer, more complex story. The gift of the story. In the end, what Plato gave us wasn't a historical account or a geographical puzzle. He gave us a story, and stories are humanity's most ancient technology for processing complex truths. The story of Atlantis helps us think about how civilizations rise and fall, how virtue can be corrupted, how hubris invites catastrophe, how the mighty can fall and the forgotten might have once been great. These are important thoughts worth thinking regardless of whether Atlantis literally existed. The story also gives us wonder, that most precious and increasingly rare commodity. In our mapped, photographed, GPS-located world, we need spaces for mystery, for the unknown, for the possibility of discovery. Atlantis provides that space. So let the scientists continue searching the seafloor with their sonar and submersibles. Let the archaeologists dig through Mediterranean ruins looking for Bronze Age catastrophes. Let the mystics meditate on Atlantean past lives and the theorists propose new locations, but also recognize that the real Atlantis exists wherever humans gather around fires, literal or metaphorical, and tells stories about what was lost and what might be found, about hubris and humility, about the impermanence of power and the permanence of mystery. And now, the story pauses. The waves roll over whatever may or may not lie beneath them. The search continues, as it has for 2,400 years and will for 2,400 more. Atlantis remains as it always has at the edge of reality, far enough away to stay mysterious, close enough to keep us hoping, real enough to matter even if it never existed at all. Good night, and may you dream of cities beneath the waves, of wisdom lost and found, of mysteries that refuse to be solved, and truths that don't require proof to be meaningful. I want to do a new video, about Atlantis, but this time let it be 8,000 words.